7. Let's just go through this. This is our last thing. We'll go over this verse, and then we'll get over to Romans with the lesson this morning. Mark 3. So let's do reference verse reference, right?
Mark 3:27. No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except you will first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house. Mark 3:27.
Right.
All right, gentlemen, if you would please turn to the book of Romans. We'll be in chapter number 2. Romans chapter 2. Now, the book of Romans in the first 3 chapters kind of culminating with Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The Apostle Paul is trying to show how all men are guilty under sin. And the section that we're going to talk about this morning, we're going to springboard from, really talks about the Jew and the Gentile and how they're a little bit different. And one of the things that separates them is this idea of circumcision. So the key verse is going to be 29, but let's back up a little bit to verse number 26. Romans 2, verse number 26. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision dost transgress the law? For he is a Jew, for he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. Neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. So we see a couple things here. One is the idea of the contrast between the Jew and the Gentile. And then we get into this issue about circumcision and whether or not you're keeping the law, right? So, but the thing I want to focus in on is where this where the crux of the issue is, which is in verse number 29. And if you would focus in on, it's that of the heart in the spirit. So there's a heart issue that we want to talk about here this morning. Obviously, circumcision is, as Paul just mentioned, it's an outward thing done in the flesh. And does anybody know where that idea came from? Anybody remember where this idea of circumcision started?
Genesis 17, where it's referenced.
Right. Genesis 17. So we'll go there. Let's talk about the actual physical process of circumcision. Who instituted it, when, and why? Now, there won't be any PowerPoints. Okay. There won't be any short videos. Okay. But we'll go back to Genesis 17 and we'll see what God says there to Abraham. Now, recall this is to Abraham. This is before the law. So this is a thing which was instituted well before Moses, well before the law. And it's after God had made his promises to Abraham about the Messiah. So if you go back to Genesis 12, when Abraham is 75 years old, God gives him a specific promise. And he says, I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So he's promising him progeny, and he's also promising him something deeper, that all the world will be blessed through him. So he's still waiting on this promised child, right? And we have the idea of, or the sequence of events there where he ended up following and chasing after Lot, and Lot and the people were taken by the kings, and he goes and he rescues them. Okay, 75 and up, right? A lot of activity. Speaking of men of activity, a 75-year-old man still waiting on God's promise. And in chapter 17, we see in verse 1, and when Abraham was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. And then he renames him and firms up the covenant. Skip down with me to verse number 9. And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you. Every man child in your generations, he is born in thy house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man child, whose flesh is of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. He then renamed Sarah or Sarai as Sarah, and skip down to verse 23 for me. And Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the self same day, as God had said unto him. So a couple things to note here about what happened with this idea of circumcision. First off, it was a command of God, right? That's number one. So the physical process here, we have a command of God and we have the immediate obedience of Abraham. I don't know about you, but sometimes when, God is impressing upon me to do something, there's a pause. There's a desire for some confirmation. There's the desire to maybe even resist. But Abraham, still waiting on God's promise, gets this renaming and another covenant, yet without the son of promise, mind you, right? He has the son of Hagar. He has Ishmael. He's 99 years old, and he takes upon him this outward appearance, right? This outward sign, this outward symbol. So, this process is probably not pleasant at his age. I don't know what kind of anesthesia they had at the time. Maybe there was something natural that they knew of, that if you crush a plant and rub it on an open wound, it would numb you up. I don't know how many days it would take. Other sections of the Bible talk about after 3 days, the men could function again, right? But it wasn't pleasant. And you can imagine if you were Ishmael or one of the men bought into Abraham's house or one of the men in Abraham's house, you might be asking yourself a simple question, right? What would that question be? Anybody? Why? Right. Why? So what's the purpose? So we have a command and we have instant obedience, right, from the leader of the home, the man who has the message, but the people follow along also, but there's probably a question of why. So what did God say in those verses there, if anybody can recall? What did God say the purpose of this covenant was? Why were they to be circumcised? What did it do for them? Anybody?
It's a token.
Yeah. It's a token. It's a symbol, right? It's an outward appearance.
A reminder.
Maybe a reminder. Yeah, that's a pretty good reminder.
Yeah.
When you do your business, every time you do your business.
Separation.
And it's a
I
separation.
have that seal. I have that. Now I'm separated. Or I'm made righteous by that seal.
Well, yeah, you definitely have the mark in your flesh. I don't know that that's necessarily a symbol of righteousness. You've undertaken it because, as we see in Romans there's a difference between lopping off some flesh and doing it for the right reasons, right? Because the Gentile who keeps the law, which came later, is a Jew in his heart without the mark.
We are separated. We become righteous later. So, but yeah, I'm good.
Well, Brian, I wonder why the Lord would have you be circumcised rather than another outward appearance like an earring or like you say, lopping up a part of the ear or something. I just wonder.
Yeah, take a thumb.
Yeah.
Something else. I don't know, but it's kind of close to home, isn't it?
It is. It's very personal. Very personal.
It's very personal. It's
Who's going to
humbling.
build a large nation, right? I don't know. I just threw that out there. I don't know.
Well, there are also sanitary reasons too for it.
There could be some practical reasons, right? Some practical reasons.
I think verse 11 says betwixt me and you.
Yeah.
So it was something that there was a private thing between them and God. It wasn't supposed to be, something that everybody was to
Right.
see,
Right.
Yeah.
And very, very private.
And then
right?
I think you asked a good question, because this is not the question you ask all the time. It's so applicable. God, why would you want me to do that?
Mhm.
Like, I asked them, why do you want me to go to Pittsburgh?
Yeah.
I asked him that. Why do you want me to go to Pittsburgh? Why can't I go somewhere else?
Because the weather's so good.
Yeah, yeah. We always ask that question, it's a matter of trust.
Well, it is. And I think that if we go back to Romans chapter 3, so that's the physical process and why he did it, right? It's a private thing betwixt me and you, right? But it was to mark the man, an outward symbol kind of your heart, right? Abraham had this desire to follow after God. God gave him this mark in his flesh. You know, we have to be careful, though, that the mark of the flesh or the outward appearance doesn't become the thing that is our hallmark without the inward being right. And that's why it's a hard issue. That's why it's a hard issue. So if we go,
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt again, but it also shows the willingness of Abraham to obey. Because if God were to say, "Oh, I just want you to put an earring in your ear or lop off your ear," that's easy. I mean, relatively speaking.
right,
Versus
Right.
circumcision, which is much more,
right.
much more of a like, I really need to be humble and I really need to take this seriously.
I agree. I agree.
There's a lot of things God asks us to do that are outside the comfort zone that are very not convenient, don't make sense, are very uncomfortable, but God continues to stretch us and ask us to do those things.
Funny that you use that word, stretch. Right?
Yeah.
Stretch, grow,
Mhm.
continue to work on,
Mhm.
you know. And so I was reading in Romans with the Bible study plan. And every time I come across this, I'm convicted.
Mhm.
Every time I come across chapter 2, talking about circumcision of the heart, I'm convicted. Because I'll say this, and the second bullet there is going to be, it's a spiritual process, right? So we have the physical process of circumcision, right? But now what about the spiritual process in the heart, right? It's a heart issue. How many of us have had a problem with our heart and gotten an EKG or some sort of heart procedure? Anybody? Right. We only have one heart, right? And we don't want it to fail. And when it gets racing or you get indigestion or something and it feels like a heart attack, or I did weed whacking at my last house, you know, we had a nice long rock wall at the back, a rock wall along the front, plenty of beds, split rail fencing everywhere, a nice garden in the back, and a nice play set. I had a weed whacking marathon for about 2.5 or 3 hours. And the next day I thought I had left arm pain, shooting down my left. I thought it was shooting. Don't really know what shooting pain is, but you know, you got pain in your elbow. You go in and you get, you know, an EKG, you get a heart scan, and you find out whether or not because as your brain starts to play with it, you know, you think you're worried about your heart. You only have one of them. And obviously this is talking about our spiritual heart here. But he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. Circumcision is that of the heart and the spirit, and not of the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. So why is the heart, the spiritual heart, so important? Jesse?
According to Jeremiah 17:9, it's incurably sick.
Yeah.
It has to be.
Okay.
And Christ is the only cure.
I agree. How about Proverbs 4:23, real quick?
Oh,
Bounce out there. Do you have it?
That's where I'll go.
Do you have it?
Yep.
Would you mind reading that for us?
Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.
Yeah. You know, you think about your heart, and this is a compilation of many lessons that are, you know, decisions, pride versus humility, right? Men of activity, what kind of activity? What's the motive behind the activity, right? Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. And if you look around that in Proverbs chapter 4, my son, attend to my words, verse 20, incline thine ear unto my sayings. This is not one of those back and forths, right? The fool says this, but the wise do that. No, this is a list of things. It's a pleading from Solomon. Let them not depart from thine eyes. Keep them in the midst of thine heart. For they are life unto those that find them, and health unto all their flesh. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. Ponder the path of thy feet, and let all thy ways be established. Turn not to the right hand nor to the left. Remove thy foot from evil. You know, the heart is the first thing that he's talking about in there, the wisdom and the heart. And our heart, we have to keep it with all diligence. You know, you think about Romans chapter 10. I know I'm bouncing around here. But Romans chapter 10 and verse number 9, what else happens with the heart? Why is it so important? Keep it with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Romans 10:9, that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. Why? For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. You go all the way back to Abraham, before the law, before circumcision, right? Abraham believed God and he counted it to him for righteousness, right? We believe God and he counts it to us for righteousness. So the heart is where that belief happens. And then from that heart, right, we can express, right? The heart is the key part in the spiritual process. And this idea of circumcision of the heart, what ideas might come out of our heart, right? You said the heart is desperately wicked, right?
Anything fleshly and sinful.
So we're born again, we have a spiritual heart. We're born, we have a fleshy heart. We're born again, we have a spiritual heart. And we have to choose an elective surgery. Similar to circumcision. Yeah. Right? We have to choose a spiritual elective surgery. And we have to go in there, let God go in there. We have to submit like Abraham did, right? We have to say, you know what, I want your word to permeate my heart. I want your word to control my heart. I want my heart to be your heart. Use my heart, be my heart. Those kinds of thoughts. And fill ourselves up with the word of God. Let our mind, let our heart, let them be joined together. Let the eye gate be pure. Let the ear gate, let them, the mouth is what comes out of the heart, but what comes into the eye and goes into our mind can affect our heart, right? So that circumcision of the heart is really a kind of an amalgamation of the things that we've been talking about. Decisions, right? Submission. Be men of activity, but with the right motives, right? And I really, every time I come through here, I just, wow, right? I'm going to let you fish around in there and cut out the part that I want to do. Cast that aside if it's not consecrated to your will, that part of what I want to do. If it's not humbled and submitted to your will and blessed by you, I probably don't want to do it, right? So cut it off, that desire of my heart, whether it be for fame, position, stuff, acceptance. Go down the list, right? Whatever it is, cut it off and throw it away. There's not, to my knowledge, there's not a plastic surgery to undo circumcision, right? And we shouldn't allow ourselves to go back to that fleshy heart if we allow God to cut it off. So an elective surgery, right? If I had bicuspid aortic valve syndrome, right? That's a genetic, it's a birth defect where that aortic valve only has two flaps. I looked it up the other night, right? It's supposed to be a tricuspid valve. It's supposed to open up like a little flower with three petals. Instead, it only has two. And what happens is eventually you get calcification and stenosis because of blood flow not being proper, et cetera. It leads to shortened life. So they want to monitor that. And anyway, tricuspid. You can get a surgery probably to fix that. Yeah. Right. Get a new heart valve put in. Right. But do we allow God the opportunity to have our spiritual heart surgery? And it's to fortify the spiritual heart, but moreover, it's to cut off, cut away, and throw away that fleshy part of our heart. And what's the purpose? What's the outgrowth? Right? If we have a spiritual heart, as it says in the verse, right? Circumcision is that of the heart and the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God, right? So the circumcision in the flesh, what was happening for the recipients of the book of Romans was people were thumping their chests because they had been circumcised. I'm a Jew, look at me, I'm circumcised, just like Abe, right? I'm a Jew, look at me, I strain I wash my hands before I eat, right? I strain the water to get the gnats out, but the pot is all messy, right? But look at me, look, that's not done from the right heart, right? And that's praise of men that they can see them. We see examples of this in the Bible all the time where Jesus sees the Pharisee praying with all kinds of trumpeting and, you know, going in and making loud noises, pay attention to me, dumping in all my money, right? Versus the widow that throws in all she has. It's only a little. The man that prays, you know, and the tax collector who just silently is there. It's not about the outward, it's a matter of the heart. So, you know, let's do what we can let's let God do what he wants to from our heart, and let the outgrowth of that in our life be to his honor and glory. That's kind of my application. So maybe you've thought of another application. Any other thoughts?
I think because the circumcision is so personal and hidden, it kind of illustrates integrity. To have integrity and the importance of that.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I'm gonna regress a little, not application, but probably from a reference in my Bible, but the heart one probably is more in the Old Testament is Deuteronomy 30. And that basically heart's mentioned many times, but in my version of the verse 6 and 30, the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that they may love him with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your life. And this, when you and your children return to the Lord, to God, and obey him with all of your heart and with all of your soul, according to everything I have commanded you. So there is a sort of transition in from Genesis to, we do move to a heart job in the Old Testament even. I mean, all you have to read Psalms, you can find 50,000, you know, the old thing, Saul, no heart, David, all heart, and who's next? Oh, I was gonna say Samson, Solomon, half heart, but no, it's not Samson. But at any rate, there is that sort of transitions, and you know, obviously, three famous kings of the Old Testament. It was a hard job for them more than anything else.
Yeah, I think we can tell a lot from.
I didn't mean to regret, but
No,
there's 100 applications. I'm sure regenerated with that new heart, all those kinds of things. But
Sure.
it's just been 30 is an interesting, chapter that really has a lot of conversion there that we sort of overlook. Well, I don't think that much like anybody else. I read Leviticus less. They go together a little, but.
Other applications, something God's laid on your heart? I'll share.
I think the circumcision of the heart, much of what God does is not for us to put forward and say, hey, look what I did. And the circumcision of the heart, nobody can see that. Nobody's aware of it except for the individual. And I think that's in keeping with pride and everything else. God, if he wanted you to put an earring in your ear or cut your ear off or cut your nose off or whatever, that would be visible to people and you could be recognized for that step. But the circumcision of the heart is even more private than the physical circumcision because it's not visible to anybody. And I think that's in keeping with God's desire for us to be humble and not to be boastful of what he's done for us in a private way.
Piggybacking off of, I guess, three people said so far, sorry, Pastor, in the beginning, and moving along, Jesse, and what you just said now, it's a private thing. And that goes hand in hand with the praise of men, the praise of God. Right. And if, there's other passages, but 1 Corinthians talks about Paul saying to them, he that judges me is the Lord, therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts, and then shall every man have praise of God. And I don't know why it keeps coming to my head is those morning devotions I have. but we all have, right? It's not supposed to be before men. And you're not supposed to be praised by them. You're supposed to be praised by God. And you get in the word by yourself. And if it's like, I don't need everyone to see me have my Bible open. I just want God to know I'm talking to them. And that is I don't know how to explain that, but it hit me today on that aspect of it. It's you and God. Don't worry about other people. You and God.
I think that there are certain things God may ask me to cut away or you to cut away. And it may be different for you than somebody else. So I think it's us being in tune with God. Just because God says, take this out of your life, doesn't mean everybody else has to take that out of their life. But for me, God told me to do that. And I think that's where personal convictions come in place of, I'm not necessarily going to judge you on what you do or don't do, but for me, God told me to not do this or to do this. And Abraham was convinced of that. So I think we have to have personal convictions of what God tells us to cut away and not base that on what other people are doing or not doing.
Other thoughts or applications this morning?
Hey, Brian, I have a comment.
Go ahead, Nick.
So, and this may be an unwanted comment because it has to do with women, and this is a men's study, and this is a covenant between Abraham and God that we're, ultimately talking about in Genesis. But I can't help but think, as the father of 4 daughters, when women read this, and when women were going through this time period, with hearing about the circumcision and thinking like, well, what do I do to be righteous? What do I do to be favored in the eyes of God? But then when you come to Romans, and I just wonder, I don't know if I could say this or not, but it almost opens it up to men and women. That it's not about necessarily physical circumcision because that's limited to one over the other, but it's a heart issue. And that applies to women too. And then applies to girls because girls can be saved. Girls can go to heaven. Women can have a personal relationship with God. And they need to remember it's not because you're a Jew. It's not because you're a male that got circumcised, but it's because you have that personal relationship with God. And it's a heart issue. And the floodgates just kind of open up from there. So I don't know if you agree with that or if that's fair to say, but that's just something that I'm thinking about.
I think you would add to that, maybe the application in the Old Testament is that it should start with us as men. That's why we have this men's study. If you can strengthen the men, you'll strengthen the ladies, you'll strengthen the home, you strengthen the nation. Start with the men. So we are to be the spiritual leaders. But as it applies to salvation, I agree absolutely with what Nick's saying with that.
And I think also you think about Abraham's submission to God in this act, right? He's the patriarch. He's the start of it all, right? For that promise. And yet God said it and he did it. He submitted to God's will. So sometimes in the world there, and even it can happen in our hearts too, there's this mentality of you always want to be higher up in the pecking order. And therefore you're without reproach, right? Because I'm powerful. We all answer, right? And it's a question of whether or not we're going to submit to the will of God in our role, right? And so he submitted right there and did this thing to his flesh. It's a great example of submission, submission and obedience, and servant leadership. It's all in there.
I thought when Nick was talking about, that just blew my mind. Yeah, well, genealogy of Jesus, there's 3 of them there. There are 2 women that I grew up with. But yeah, it is. The pastor says the leadership comes from Jesus Christ and the family. So I don't even think that's the reason in the Old Testament was the male. That was more dominant, but it was obviously where the leadership should come from. It was the earthly leadership.
Yeah, and leading the way in submission, we often think about, well, that's the word for the wife, but according to Scripture, we're to set the example as we submit to God, that they'll be willing to submit to us.
Wasn't there a verse that said, sin is passed down from the father?
Generations.
Yeah, and Jesus, I'm just reading here, Jesus was talking about, it makes a great question, but Jesus was talking about it later too. And it's talking about how from the father to the father was a token. And then you come into Romans where it talks about what the law cannot do of the flesh. And I think that does tie in where sin's passed down from the father, generation to the father. So the token had to apply to the father. The instrument of sin or the pathway of sin had to apply to that. And so when you look at it that way, it's like women are not being cut off at all. And the other way, it's like, hey, you guys don't have you're all sinners, but you don't have that channel of sin that passes down to the kids. So that's where the token has to apply. And then later in Romans, old covenant gone.
Good. So I think the challenge then for us as we move from this lesson, which was really well done, thank you, Brian, for your efforts in that, is to, be prayerful and very sensitive to the Spirit as I think if we will listen, he will point out some specifics in our life that maybe are things that we're holding on to. And maybe it's not necessarily a simple thing, but just something that's hindering us from doing the work of God like he wants us to, and allow him as he directs, allow him to take that away. And that's not going to be easy for us to let go of some things. But if we're willing to do that, then we'll be able to serve God in a much greater capacity.
And just to add this, Pastor, the reason I didn't want to make an application that was specific, that was derived from me. I want to kind of let it rattle around there a little bit and see how God applied it to your hearts. But for me,